Okay, I think we'll start. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Cooperation Live call on childcare and early years, the impact the COVID outbreak has had on the sector. So tonight we'll be chatting a bit about the implications of the pandemic on the early years sector, both in terms of service providers, such as nurseries, and on the children and families who rely on them as well. So I'm Rob Bates, I'm the Cooperative Party's Political and Parliamentary Officer. You won't be hearing too much from me because we've got some fantastic guest speakers tonight. So before I introduce them and we get onto the main discussion, I'll just run through some housekeeping rules, which, given how long we've all spent on Zoom, you'll all be pretty much familiar with by now, but just to reiterate. So firstly, just to note that this call is being recorded. Members can't always, and guests can't always access our calls on time or straight away. So what we do is record the calls and pop them on our YouTube channel afterwards to make sure they're as accessible as possible for everyone. So this is a heads up that you are being recorded. If you prefer to stay off, just flick the camera off now and head straight to audio, and that should be absolutely fine. You'll also notice you're muted. That's just to make sure that we can keep the call clear and avoid distractions of dogs and doorbells in the background. So if you're speaking, if you're asked to ask a question, you'll be able to unmute, and then you'll find yourself remuted afterwards. So following the presentation, we'll hold a quick question and answer session where you'll be able to ask questions on the things we've discussed. So there's a few ways you can ask a question. You can click on the icon labelled participants at the bottom centre of your PC or phone. Click on the button labelled raise your hand. Your digital hand will then be raised. I'll keep an eye out for you and I'll ask you a question if that's the case. You can put your question in the chat box, or you can send your question. You can email it to Izzy, who's hiding behind our co-op B, at events@party.coop, which has been monitored by Izzy, events@party.coop. So as I say, when it's your turn to ask a question, we'll say your name, we'll unmute you, or you mute yourself, and then ask away. And finally, just a reminder, as always, that we reckon our co-op values should be reflected in our actions as well as our policies. So we expect everyone here to feel safe, welcome and respected. So please do bear that in mind when you're making your contributions. So without further ado, I'll pass over to our first speaker, and I'd like to say we're joined by Fleur Anderson. Fleur is the MP for Putney and the Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office. Now, over recent weeks, Fleur's done some fantastic work in Parliament, highlighting so many of the areas that seem to have fallen through the cracks in response to this, in the government's response to this crisis. So everything from dentistry to veterans, and it was a case last week that Fleur held a really important debate in Parliament on childcare. Holding government to account there, and I'll join us tonight, Fleur. I'll pass over to yourself without further ado, and you can chat to us a bit more about what you've been working on.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob, and good evening and welcome to everyone who's joined. I'm really, really honoured and delighted to have been asked to speak this evening on such an important issue. I just think the early years sector has been ignored and forgotten so much during this crisis, and so having this meeting is an important step on the way towards making sure that the early years sector is heard, especially because of all of the impact of COVID-19 is having on the early years sector in all its ways. And hello to all of the cooperative nurseries across the country. It's fantastic. The work that you do is fantastic. I'm a really proud member of the Cooperative Party and Co-operator, and I'll be really interested to hear your views and your reflection on how the cooperative model is really resilient and able to cope in these really, really difficult times. So fantastic to be here, and thank you very, very much. And I really look forward to a lot of chat and discussion later. But I'd just like to start by saying a huge thank you to all of the early years leaders and staff and childminders who've kept rising to the challenges thrown at you during the pandemic. It's just been changes week by week. And you have, on top of all of this, kept putting the needs of children first. You are some of the unsung heroes of COVID-19, putting sometimes your lives at risk to educate and care for our children. And as I've said far too often before the pandemic, but now during the pandemic, the early years sector has been an afterthought too much. That was seen sometimes in some of the education guidance that was given out by the Department for Education didn't include the early years sector. I know this has been enormously frustrating. Yet all the evidence, as you know, shows that preschool education is vital to achieving a child's potential. And going to school already months or even years behind is too often a guide to underachievement later. It's absolutely crucial that we get this right. As you know also, early years settings are essential and provide long-term benefits for the economy and society. They help to close the attainment gap between children from low-income families and their more advantaged peers, and remove barriers to employment, particularly for women, who are still disproportionately responsible for unpaid care, and so much more. I've got 4 children. I was introduced to early years education through them, and I've been an absolute champion ever since. I'm also on the Education Select Committee, and we have been raising early years issues constantly. So some of the information I've got from this evening is from that, and do ask me questions about the questions we've been asking to the Secretary of State, and in this week in a medical experts panel as well. Early years has been raised recently, as Rob said, in a Westminster Hall debate last week, and also there was an all-party parliamentary group on childcare, and a whole section in the Education Select Committee. So the early years are being talked about more than ever at the moment, because you are being asked to stay open for all children when primary and secondary schools are not. So the spotlight really is on you, and I can understand all the concerns that are being faced at the moment. 2 local nursery head teachers were in touch with me recently and said, we're proud to be open, but we need support and clearly thought out guidance focused on the early years. We're looking after the children, but who is looking after the staff? And another said, we really feel like the forgotten sector. If primary schools in the UK and nurseries in Scotland are only open for key workers, why not nurseries in England and Wales? And so I pay tribute to the Co-operative Childcare movement, to the Early Years Alliance, to PACey, and to the National Education Union, who are coordinating and championing the sector and running campaigns for the change that's needed. And early years leaders in my constituency, and I'd love to hear feedback from you as well, have 2 major concerns that haven't been addressed by the government sufficiently yet. They are safety and funding. So first, on safety, there's a huge concern from early years staff about the safety of being open. And I've been asking the government to publish the evidence base for nurseries being open, and quizzed medical experts from the Department for Education yesterday, and asking whether they will review the transmission rates regularly and revise the decision to be open if needed. Early years staff do feel like they're putting their lives in danger coming into school. Obviously, there can't be social distancing, and nor should there be. One local head teacher said to me, I've been an early years professional for over 30 years, and today is the first time I go to work fearing for the safety of my staff, myself, and that of my family. I've been asking about lateral flow testing, and the fact that private nurseries are in a different whole cohort from nurseries attached to primary schools and state maintained nurseries, in that they're in the community testing stream rather than the education testing stream. For my local nurseries, that's meant they're being told to go to the local town hall, quite a way away, and told to go during the hours when they have to be at school. So that doesn't suit them at all. So I've been asking for changes on that. That the community testing should be twice a week, but I don't know if early years staff are getting that testing and the testing they need. Last week, the Prime Minister said that, especially as regards the new variant, schools are vectors for transmission. That's why they've been closed. But why isn't this the case for early years settings, where I know that the transmission rate is lower the younger you are, but that still doesn't mean that that community aspect of transmission isn't there for early years settings. And financially is a very big concern, I know, for nurseries across the country. The UK's child sector has been crushed by COVID-19. There was already a £660 million shortfall in early year funding before the pandemic. And I would recommend that you read, if you haven't, maybe you probably have it as your bedside reading, the Education Select Committee's report from 2019 called Tackling Disadvantage in the Early Years, which there set out a lot of the financial issues faced by the early years sector already there. There were 24 recommendations, I think, but as for my counting, only 3 have been answered. There's a lot more that needs to be done there. So really, COVID-19 is just exacerbating and potentially baking in the inequality in the early years sector. The financial issues faced by early years settings will result in closures. It has already resulted in closures, And it's a real risk to the diversity of early years settings, the different types of settings, but also where they are as well. And the real risk that they will remain open more in the more advantaged areas rather than the disadvantaged areas. And there's statistics showing that this is a real risk at the moment. It could be just survival of the fittest, or survival of the ones with the most accommodating landlord, or survival where those councils are paying out the free entitlement and not for others, or any number of factors, the basis of which, rather than the places they need to be open for our children. On top of this, the decision to allocate funding from this month on the basis of current occupancy rather than pre-COVID occupancy levels is very misguided and will spell financial ruin for thousands of nurseries. So it has now been agreed by the government that when they conduct the census on which they will base the funding, that will be done on the basis of all the children on the roll, rather than those ones actually in the settings, which had been a concern before, because lots of children understandably are absent, or their parents can't bring them in, or their parents don't want to bring them in at the moment. So the census will be done on the basis of children on the roll, but it won't be done on the basis of children on the roll pre-COVID, which is what the costs of the nursery are actually based on, rather than now, because it's understandably reduced for many reasons outside the control of nurseries. Many nursery costs are fixed, such as rents, insurance and salaries, and yet attendance is down because of illness, concerns about going in, being told to stay at home, as we all are, or lower enrolment, and parents having reduced incomes to themselves. Furlough costs were the only financial support received by many nurseries, but these costs went straight to the staff and didn't cover the rents or running costs. So I know that there are many staff in my constituency that are now running, they're not taking their salary. Many leaders are not taking their salaries or reduced salaries or managing on reserves, but this won't be able to continue. And the issue of the free entitlement funding from councils must be addressed. So councils still receive the free entitlement funding, but only some of them, I understand, are passing this on to nurseries. And some of them, as I've said, on the basis of the number of children present. So this needs to be looked into. Many nurseries were not eligible for a small business grant, as many don't pay business rates. And maintained nurseries do pay business rates, but were not allowed to apply for a business rates holiday. And that's a big issue for maintained nurseries who feel they're not having parity with with nurseries in primary schools. They don't have access to the COVID catch-up funding. And catch-up is absolutely essential at the moment, and will be for reaching back to pre-COVID levels of education. That catch-up fund should be accessible by all. And as another nursery head has pointed out to me, there has been no financial support offered when settings have to close for up to 10 days because of a positive test, or for cover staff, which they do not have the finances to cover. There are only 389 maintained nursery schools left in the UK, and I know that many are hubs and support all the nurseries in their areas, including cooperative nurseries in their areas. And it is essential that this vital part of our nursery provision is maintained. But maintained nurseries were in major financial crisis in COVID, given sort of limping along, being given year by year funding. They need multi-year funding, increased funding, and the ability to claim for funds spent on PPE, which are very significant for many. Closures of early years settings across the country are high risk and will deepen both financial and educational inequalities, whilst slowing down the recovery from the pandemic. So I have several urgent demands that I've been asking for in wherever I can, and I hope you can join with me in this. So first of all, on safety, I've been asking about testing and the needs for tests accessible to all childcare settings, and also asking for funding for PPE for early years staff, and for a vaccination. So when teachers are included, when it comes down to that stage, the early years staff must be included. We can't have this difference between different staff. And then funding for parity of education funding with schools, as I've said, and ensuring that councils pass on the free entitlement that they receive from the government to nurseries. and they do not cut the funding for absent children. And also funding for, and looking at the sufficiency figures for different areas, and understanding which nursery schools are at risk and stopping them from being closed before they close, because returning to that childcare provision afterwards is going to be very, very difficult. But supporting nurseries now is much easier and should be a real priority of the government. And I've asked for business rates holidays for maintained nursery schools, and for the education ministers to work with their colleagues in the Treasury to have a comprehensive new package of financial support for the private and maintained early years sectors to save the sector. So I'll conclude with a quote from the head teacher of the nursery in my constituency, who has said, "But who are we, the forgotten educators, who ensure that people continue to go to work, knowing their precious children will be cared for and educated safely? We're in trouble. We need your help. We have been given no support for PPE or to implement extra hygienic measures. Our staff are putting themselves at risk every day, and we do it willingly. We do it because we're early years professionals and because we care, but please, we need help. If early years settings go bankrupt because of lack of government support, who will look after our children, your children, in the future?" It's really important that we work together for the early years sector to make sure that we are a strong sector both now, but also stronger in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. It's fantastic to hear, and so much of the work you're doing around it, particularly the stuff in and around the Education Select Committee. I'm sure we'll want to revisit some of that. I sense there's a couple of themes in there which will be consistent throughout, the two concerns around safety and financial support. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that shortly as I bring in Pete Wessel from Mid-Counties Co-operative, who is the Chief Values Officer. Now, Pete, I wonder, rather than giving you too much of an introduction, I wonder if it's worth telling us about what you do, what Mid-Counties Co-operative do, and your links with Childcare before bringing in Sally. And just a reminder to everyone as well, keep your questions coming in, keep those hands up, and we'll get to you shortly. So, Pete, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. And Fleur, thank you for so eloquently making the case, I think, on behalf of so many of us in the childcare sector. Good evening, everybody. Mid-Counties Co-op is the second largest independent co-op in the UK. We have many business interests, including utilities, pharmacies, funeral homes, food, travel, and obviously childcare, we'll talk about in a second. That probably gives us a fairly unique view, I think, of the economy and, more importantly, the communities that we serve over the last 12 months or so. And the one common thing that we're trying to do on behalf of our 700,000 members, Rob, as well as all our customers, our childcare parents, etc., is this single word: fairness. And there is an element of all of us, I think, where as a commercial business, which is what we are as a co-op, we're not after handouts, we're not after charity, we're just after people saying, can you consider every one of these business operations, funeral or whatever, in the light of the challenges we are currently all facing? It's right at this point to both the Co-op Party and everybody on this call to say thank you. Over the course of the last 10 months or so, the Co-op Party with Rob and Joe Fortune and others, and indeed the parliamentary group, have been absolutely centre stage in pushing the right thing for our customers, our members, but also for co-ops, particularly with things like freedom from fear and assaults on shop workers, on things like travel refunds, and where we sit with legislation which clearly wasn't designed to deal with the COVID situation, whether it be funeral, but particularly now, I guess, in terms of childcare. And this is probably the single biggest area where we need government intervention. We have 45 childcare nurseries. We are fortunate in Sally, as Chief Operating Officer for those nurseries, has a wealth of experience in the sector, is seen by many as a voice of the sector, and has led us as an executive team, members, and the board of Mid-Counties Co-op in doing the right thing. And that's why Sally, I'm delighted she can join us here tonight. She will echo many of the things that you said, Fleur, and hopefully we can then get this to a really good debate in terms of taking it forward. So Sally, with no further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Pete, and good evening, everybody. As Pete very kindly introduced me, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Co-op Childcare, and I'm just going to share a few slides with you, if I may, just introducing us and what we do, how we've responded to 2020, and some of the safety concerns that we have. Okay. Ooh, now I can't get back onto my slides. Wait 1 second. Okay. Rob, if you could go on to the next slide for me, that would be great. So, as I said, thank you for allowing us to come along today and sharing some of the issues that we really care about in the early years sector particularly. So Co-op Childcare offer 3,483 places across 45 of our nurseries, which span the entire country. And that places us 7th of the largest 25 providers in the UK, with the biggest provider actually offering a staggering 32,000 places. Our group has a real diverse portfolio of premises servicing a variety of workplace, partnerships and communities, and predominantly we're located in the larger conurbations of medium and to low affluence areas. We employ over 1,300 colleagues across the 45 nurseries across our field and central support functions. And all of our nurseries are good and outstanding, Ofsted outstanding that is. And these little guys that you can see at the bottom of our screen are our little pioneers, and they help us share our values with the children and encourage them to make their own choice, express their feelings, and really make a difference in the world. Thanks, Rob. So I just wanted to start with saying how incredibly proud we are of our childcare team and the early years sector to provide early education to our children and families throughout the pandemic. They really have been heroes throughout through COVID-19, providing that security and that stability and consistency through an incredibly tough time. We know that the impact of the pandemic has been really tough on children throughout the country, and the need for our services with parents relying on us to support them in the care and development of their children whilst they do their bit for their customers. So taking stock of a really difficult year, I just wanted to quickly share with you some of the big differences that has made us really proud to be able to offer through 2020. So as you know, back in late March, nurseries closed to all but critical and vulnerable families. And then we were able to safely reopen in June, and we did so without compromising the health and happiness of the children. We offered as much help and clarity as we could for our families through updated FAQs, through top tips, online resources, videos, blogs, two-way communications, and simple steps for helping children's mental health, well-being, and home learning packages as well, especially for those children who still couldn't access our nurseries. We clap for carers every Thursday evening at 8 o'clock virtually. We developed video testimonials from the people who were most thankful that we stayed open. All of our children had bespoke settling back in plans alongside home learning packages for families who couldn't access our services. We even launched a Frontline Hero Support Fund that together raised over £40,000 and helped benefit 150 key workers with 50% of their fees. We had to think really differently as to how we carried out our show rounds because visitors weren't and still aren't allowed in our nurseries, and it's a kiss and drop sort of service. So to mitigate the virus coming into our nurseries, we went virtual, and all our show rounds and tours at the moment, all our parent evenings, everything are done digitally. And to date, we have carried out over 3,000 virtual tours. It was important to us to maintain our intergenerational programs, and we knew that our elderly friends still wanted to stay in touch with us too. So we continued our intergenerational relationships across all 45 of our nurseries using technology. We hosted a record-breaking open day in September with over 1,000 pre-booked slots. So that does demonstrate that there is still a demand there. And we launched a Helping Hands campaign supporting families across the country who have been impacted by redundancy and unemployment as a result of the pandemic. And we were able to offer some really, some genuine help and guidance. Thanks, Rob. So throughout these challenging times, our priority has been the protection and the welfare of our colleagues and the safety of our children and families. And this will continue to remain the case. We made changes to ensure every nursery was safe and as hygienic as possible without compromising the happiness of the children, something that we've been recognised for by Public Health England themselves. So this slide demonstrates some of the additional safety measures we have implemented in our fight against coronavirus. We have always started with government guidance, but we went above and beyond to ensure that all children and team members felt happy, healthy and protected. But as a result of these measures and following conversations with providers, we believe we have one of the lowest infection rates amongst colleagues in the industry. But we estimate that the additional cost of operating safely during this pandemic is in the region of about £10,000 a month for each nursery. And this will be significantly higher for many of our larger nurseries. This equates to an additional monthly cost of around 23.5 million for the nursery sector. There is some publicity around closing all nurseries except for children of key workers, which would clearly result in occupancy rates dropping. The reality of this would result in significant losses across our nurseries. And we estimate for Co-op Childcare, this would exceed over £850,000 every month. And clearly, all other nursery operators would face similar challenges and will no longer be viable and will no longer be viable for many sites to actually stay open. And that would mean in turn that key workers would no longer be able to access childcare in these areas and therefore be unable to continue to deliver the essential service. Thanks, Rob. So in light of the government decision for early years nurseries to remain open during this third lockdown whilst instructing schools to close, we have called on the government to take urgent steps to protect the safety and financial sustainability of everyone working in nurseries across England. Nurseries have been deemed low risk, but our teams are in a unique position of being frontline workers who are unable to socially distance from children. The government must recognise the vital role that we are playing in this pandemic and give the PVI sector prioritisation for the COVID-19 vaccination as part of the government's list of over 13 million priority people, and also to be given access to the home testing kits, opposed to being lumped into the community-led testing, which operates in working hours and more often than not are 10, 12 miles away from our nurseries, which makes it really difficult to access. I guess for us, we just really don't understand why we've been treated so discriminately, especially as maintained nurseries have the same priority access to testing as schools do. In order for nurseries to keep functioning and providing what has been recognised as a vital service, ministers must provide a level playing field when it comes to COVID-19 testing and prioritise early years for the vaccination. We are also calling on the government to introduce targeted funding for providers reliant on private income and who have suffered from falls in parent demand. If nurseries are to have any hope of being able to remain open in the long term, it's vital that the government provides the necessary financial support, both for those reliant on free entitlement funding and those reliant on private parental income, to enable all settings to remain viable. It simply just feels odd to me that in the height of a global pandemic, that early years providers have been asked to stay open with such little financial support and no protection, and expected to do so safely and sustainably. Thank you.
Was that the last slide, Sally, or was that overall?
That's the last slide, yeah. So just questions slide is the last one.
Brill. So I think we've got a couple of hands up. Thanks so much for that, Sally. We'll just move on to a few questions now. The first one we've had through from a couple of people actually is on this issue of vaccines. And Duncan and Denise sent questions in by email beforehand. And I made the point that we've seen, Sally, perhaps we come to you first, how Co-op Childcare have gone above and beyond in terms of provision of PPE, but we also know it's not quite as easy as that. Social distancing isn't as easy in nurseries, and it's not quite as simple as it might be elsewhere. So how important is it, Sally, that we prioritise childcare workers in the vaccination process?
Well, at the moment, we are seeing what we call burst bubbles. Some of you may have heard that term, and what that means, where somebody, whether that's a colleague or a child, who is probably mainly asymptomatic, so we're not aware that a child may have coronavirus until they test positive. And anyone who has primary contact with a positive case have to self-isolate. In turn, what that means for us is we have to credit or take on those costs for those burst bubbles. So to mitigate that, the only option for us really is vaccination. We've got all our colleagues in PPE, all our colleagues are wearing the sterile masks as a mandatory policy, but that doesn't come into play necessarily with PHE or DFE when you've had primary contact with somebody who's tested positively. So we're seeing burst bubbles every day. Right.
Fleur, is there anything you'd like to add to that? I believe it was something you brought up with the Minister directly in your Westminster Hall debate in Parliament last week.
Yes, absolutely. If as soon as teachers in other parts of and other years are included, then early years should be included. It should be absolute parity. There shouldn't be any question, any hesitation, any confusion there. And that if there is, it will only go to show that the early years sector is not being treated as it should be by the Department for Education. So what Sally says is absolutely right, and no question.
Yeah, yeah. Sonia, I see you've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, it was refusing to unmute. Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't know whether I'm on my own or not, but I'm contacting in from South Wales. So of course we have a different government, we have different regulations, we've had different lockdowns, and we've had a different situation. I'm a councillor chairing an education committee, but I'm also a trustee and at the moment volunteer manager of a community organisation that as its main more commercial arm runs a daycare nursery. We're Flying Start registered, which means that we have a contract for Flying Start provision in Wales. I'm not sure what that's called in England. We also have we do work for social services, etc. Throughout the process, we've stayed open throughout since March, although we were only allowed to open for critical workers, children, and vulnerable families in the earlier lockdown. And in that process, throughout, we have been paid the full amount for the contracts that we have with government for those setups, but we had to guarantee not furloughing those staff, whether the children were in or not. However, it's recently, we've also had problems with grants for businesses, not counting for business rates. We've been lucky in my organisation, other nurseries not so lucky, because the whole organisation allows us to do that. But in terms of a question, my real question is that now, although we're getting some of those grants in, we're getting bits and pieces, we're getting some money for PPE, we're getting grants for sustainability for the people who aren't coming and aren't paying fees. But my concern is we do have staff off on furlough. We have had staff off on furlough. A lot of our staff are on minimum wages because of the amounts of money that people in our disadvantaged area can afford to pay for childcare. And we want to be inclusive for everybody. So, 80% of minimum wage is problematic. And while at the moment, with the grants we've just had in, we are making that up for those that are on furlough. Last lockdown, we had staff only on 80%. So that's a UK government decision, and that's really impacting on us. And, you know, is the Co-op going to link in with the Unison campaign for better pay for nursery staff and parity with teachers?
Sally, if I bring you in perhaps on that one.
I'm not sure if that one sits with me, Rob. I don't know much about the approach that the Wales are taking, so I'm not sure if I'm the right person.
Not a problem. Fleur, is there anything you'd like to sort of comment on that?
Sorry, thank you. Yes, it would be great to look up the join in with the Unison campaign. Anyone can join in with them, and the NEU campaign as well, National Education Union campaign. It's great. We need, as cooperators, we know that joining together, raising our voices together makes a big difference. And so joining in with the other campaigns that are going on right now is the time to be doing that. I think what you say, Sonia, it's great to share that, and that's one we should all be taking up. But there are lots of potential problems with this undermining of wages. So early years staff were underfunded and underpaid already. It's going to really be problematic when we've been talking for many years about more professionalisation or graduate level employment or different levels of employment within the early years sector. I think we were making far too slow progress on that already, and this is going to undermine it as well. It's already been difficult, historically difficult to recruit and to have that parity of respect as early educators, being called everything we get called and everything else from then on. That's it. Wages is absolutely crucial to the future of the early years sector, and this is only going to undermine it. So we need to fight for the parity and increase of wages for many reasons, but also for the future of the sector.
Great, thanks, Fleur. And just a reminder for everyone to keep those questions coming as hands popping up. I think, Duncan, you have a hand up if you'd like to unmute.
Yes, I'm here. I just wanted to, because you did mention my question at the very beginning, and thanks very much for that, Rob. I just wanted to talk to this idea that there could be parity between teachers and nursery staff. The whole point is that if you're wiping noses, if you're consoling crying children, if you're changing nappies, if you're trying to organise games, if you're getting children to try and imitate and to respond to what you're doing, that's a completely different thing from standing in front of a group of, even primary school children, all of whom are socially distanced. So I would query the idea that in fact there is parity between teachers and nursery staff, and say that when it comes to inoculation, there should be a priority for nursery staff, and also there should be priority for more sophisticated and better developed personal protection that is relevant to the working situation of a nursery.
Thanks, Duncan. Fleur, anything to come back on that?
Well, that's a good point, and I think you should write to your MPs and make this point for this discussion. I think the early years sector is missed out of the discussion rather than being given a higher priority as you would like to see them being given. So, and I think you make a case that should be made to MPs.
And Sally, anything on that sort of perhaps the discrepancy and difference between teaching and childcare, and actually is there a case being made that childcare providers should have priority over others?
Yeah, I would agree. As I said earlier, we're in a unique position where our teams cannot socially distance. So there's only so much PPE that we can put in place. But I think, government sometimes thinks that education starts at the school gates.
Yeah, that's great. And again, everyone, keep the questions coming. I wonder, we've touched on the safety side of things. Now, the other element was obviously the financial stability and financial security of the sector itself. Now, I wonder if I could use sort of Chair's prerogative to ask my own question. What are the implications both on the sector and childcare providers should that funding not be forthcoming? What's at stake, both for providers and also for children? What happens if they aren't provided with the childcare they need? What are the implications on attainment and educational ability and those kind of things? What would happen? What's at stake? And Sally, I don't know if you want to start on that quite general and vague question.
Well, what's at stake is vital early years education. I mean, as you alluded to earlier on, pre-COVID, it was already an underfunded sector. We already had a workforce that was in crisis, and it's only been exacerbated during the pandemic. So, the risks here are that there are going to be a number of nurseries that just can't cope, and they're going to close, which means that children and families can't access this vital early education because the funds, the cash is running out for many. We've gone 10 months now, and I think it gets to a point where you can exhaust the goodwill of the sector, and people are going to start closing their doors, which would be just such a shame.
Yeah, Fleur, anything on that?
Yeah, well, I'm a massive fan of Sure Start, and all we learnt through that period of having a huge financial boost to early years provision, and all that went forward alongside with nurseries alongside that. And we saw that we could turn that round, and we saw we could close that disadvantage gap as children arrive at school. And early years educators know how to do that the best. But then in the last 10 years, with austerity and with cuts of Sure Start and other cuts in the early years sector, we have seen that plateauing out now. And with COVID, we're going to see an increase in that disadvantage gap of children who go to school, who should have every equal benefit arriving at school, and yet some are months behind others. And we know how difficult that is then to catch up, and the long-term disadvantage that they will have. So that's what's at stake here. It's so important, and I don't think it's understood enough by the government. And so that is one whole area. The other, and what the government are calling social mobility, I'd call it social justice and equality, but that social mobility is at stake at the moment. And the other is a disparity of provision in different areas. So statistics of nurseries who are being asked, are they at risk of closure? So do they think over the next 6 months, 12 months, are they at high risk of closure? There are far more in disadvantaged areas than there are in advantaged areas. And we know that there's been deregulation of the early years sector already, with a bit of a Wild West starting up in some places. And that's not good for nurseries either, to feel that you could start up in an area where actually there's been the surplus of provision. It's not fair on anyone, but it's not fair on the most disadvantaged areas who will be losing out on this. And then you get the knock-on effect on, especially on women, on not being able to go to work, on get ahead themselves as well. In-work poverty is a massive and growing issue, and this will only be exacerbated if there's a lack of childcare available to families to be able to go out to work at different times. So the list is long and very, very worrying, and that's why the early years sector is so vitally important to being part of our building back.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a couple of hands up. Pete, just if there's anything you want to add as well, please do feel free to jump in at any point. I'm not sure on that or anything, but if you want to come in, please feel free to do on that one. We'll try and unmute you.
Right. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, it's perhaps just to make this real a little bit, because clearly we hear from the NHS Chief Executive, Simon Stevens, about the importance of early year provision for essential workers and so on and so forth. As a co-op childcare group, if, as we believe, the occupancy levels would drop, if it was a question of saying these nurseries could only open for key workers or whatever, that would cost us about £850,000 per month. This is the scale of what we're talking about. We are lucky in that we are a broad, wide cooperative with different elements of our business. There are many, many nursery groups which are not in that fortunate position. And the danger will be, unless government recognises that there is a real financial crisis hitting this sector at the moment. When we do get to build back, a lot of the groups that they're expecting to do so will no longer be in existence. And that's not a commercial position for us. That is on behalf of the sector and on behalf of the UK. It's vital that this thing is given the financial support and the recognition that it deserves. And I think that echoes exactly what Fleur was saying. This is a vital building block for all of us for the coming years. And short-termism at the moment could be a real problem here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got 3 hands up now, so I'm just going to quickly run through. So Denise, perhaps if you go first, and we'll move on to Jude and Valerie.
Okay, thank you, Rob. It's just I would like to come back on a few points that have been made. You were asking about what would we lose if nurseries had to close. Within the setting that I work in a charitable, I'm a responsible individual within a charitable organisation in North Wales. And one of our major roles is the immersion of children in the Welsh language, because the schools teach the curriculum in Welsh. So we believe for our young ones, our 2, 3 and 4-year-olds, we do a mammoth job in preparing the little ones for transition onto school. Our situation has been made very difficult because actually our parents within our Kilk, our nursery, have stopped their children coming because of fears of contagion, which we understand completely. So currently we're making absolutely nothing. My question was one of the ones that you mentioned at first about the vaccinations and about staff, which is obviously a major concern. We've got risk assessments coming out of our ears. We work with CIW in Wales, the care inspector in Wales. So all our things are in place, but we've still got major problems. So really I wanted to say that it's not just about wiping noses and changing nappies. That is important, obviously, if you've got a 2-year-old, but we have 3-year-olds who we deliver the foundation phase to. And as such, we record the progress of that child in relation to their language acquisition. So I think that early years staff do a vitally important role. It's not just standing in for parents, it's preparing them for school, for transition onto school. There's also a massive element of socialization there, where children meet with other children and learn lots of other social skills. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. Jude, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, so my question sort of links to what was just said about the development of children in these environments, but I'm going on further to primary school. So I'm in a childcare bubble with my family and another family that has 2 kids, and one of them's in nursery and the other one's just going into reception now. And I'm just wondering whether Fleur would, in theory, bring the first years of primary school back under the same logic that children need to go back and children need to learn in these environments and need to learn to socialize and develop at these ages, because little George that I look after a lot of the time, he needs this because he's not very well socialized as it is now. So I'm just asking that basically.
Great, thanks very much, Jude. Valerie, would you like to come in, then we'll move on to comments and responses.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, MP Fleur and Sally. You made some amazing points, and everybody. And thanks for letting me speak. I think mine's an observation, a bit like the last speakers. And I'm sorry about the background noise. I've got the little one here, but I think going forward, I just wonder if there can be a special manifesto pledge with the Co-operative and the Labour Party supporting early years workers, especially those from EU backgrounds and Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, because I find often they're the ones that don't get enough training and support. And we can see that in the pandemic now, that early years is just another afterthought. So I've got a friend who's one of the only male Black early years practitioners. And we know that how Black and minority ethnic communities have been hit the most with this pandemic. And it'd just be really nice to have something that kind of safeguards these workers and their specific characteristics. And just one more point, which is the SEND. The last speaker just spoke about, you know, those that are from certain backgrounds that don't get that support. And it'll be nice if there's like a special kind of, I don't know, like a funding that would actually support those families. Like in this pandemic, I think what the government is doing is not supporting those workers and the families that need the respite, even though we're in a pandemic, that have SEND needs. And that's kind of my only point. I hope that makes sense. And just a special thank you to Fleur, newly elected. I think you're amazing, and I love the Co-operative Party, and Happy New Year all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Valerie. Fleur, perhaps we come to you first. Is there any sort of thoughts or reflections on the comments we've just heard?
Thanks. A really good point about the early years. So why aren't nurseries in schools being asked to open if nurseries outside schools are being asked to open, when what we're being told about medical evidence would say that the rate of transmission is lowest for the youngest, and they're the same age. I asked this of the medical experts to the Department for Education in our session, and I said, would it be the case that then you would follow the science and open up the early years of primary schools, so foundation years of nursery and year one, earlier than the rest of the schools? Now, there's no indication that the government are going to do this at all, but that would follow the logic of the science. And there's so much inconsistency here that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Although there is the case that if you start opening up the primary school, you're then going to go and get, you're going to be confusing the message. Maybe that's part of it. You're going to be then, if you open up some of it and not others, would parents then be all coming in? Would there be mock mixing? At a time when we've seen the numbers of deaths today, it's absolutely shocking. We can't have any of those risks. That's the risk that they're balancing up. Although that you're right about that question about what will be, it's always that balance of what will be lost for those reception children, such as the one you're talking about, and what is he losing now, and the risk with going to school. So I think it's open for debate at the moment, and these are very live debates, and the decisions are being made day by day, so that you all being part as being interested in early years or early years practitioners yourselves or counsellors, and I'm a counsellor as well, so shout out to other counsellors. Thanks for raising that question, Denise, I think. So we should be having this debate about when is it safe to, because we should be part of the assessments, not leaving it all to the Department for Education, because they're just balancing risk, and we should be part of that discussion about the balance of risk. So I'm not going to give you an answer on that, but it is a valid question. I know that the NEU have been running a very strong campaign to say that it's not safe for staff, for primary schools or secondary schools to be open, and their voices need to be listened to as well, but so do early years. Thank you very much, Valerie, for raising the issues of Black and minority ethnic staff, also affected by Brexit. So I have a friend who comes from another European country. When she came back after Christmas, she was told, she's an early years practitioner, she was told, she's been working in that nursery for 10 years, she was told she wasn't going to be paid for the 2 weeks that she would have to isolate. And for her, that just tipped her over the edge. And she's now gone back to look after her elderly parents in another European country, and that's a really big loss for early years. So there's a Brexit dividend to look at in this as well, but also the particularities of risks of COVID for Black and minority ethnic staff, but also the diversity of our workforce. If all of our workforce is being reduced, the cuts altogether, they will risk any gains made in that diversity as well, and that should be a part of the conversation. So I'm so glad you raised it, as with SEND as well, and support for families, and also support for mental health. The mental health needs of our country across the board are rising by the day, and that's got to be addressed within the early years sector, the early years staff, workforce, but also our children as well. So thank you for raising that too.
Thanks, Fleur. Sally, let's bring you in next, and perhaps Pete afterwards, and we'll look to sort of head towards final words. I think I apologise. We've got some outstanding questions in hand, but I feel we might not be able to get to all of them. So, Sally, we'll go on to yourself, and then on to Pete, and then perhaps Final words from yourselves there, and then lastly from Fleur, if there's anything else to add at the end there. So Sally.
Yeah, I think just to echo what Fleur has said there, maybe not so eloquently as Fleur, but yes, it's the inconsistencies, isn't it? You know, we've been recognised as vital education. It's vital to stay open as the educational infrastructure, but not recognised in the same way as in the inconsistencies and behaviour around testing and priority for vaccinations. So, and the difference is, you know, we want to stay open, we've got to stay open. The early years can't learn from home. We can provide all the learning packages, but they can't learn virtually like your older children can. And plus with parents trying to work from home at the same time, it's not, you can't quite have a toddler running around you whilst you're trying to hold conferences on Zoom or Teams, etc. So I think, you know, if anything, it just recognises again that I think our voices need to be heard. It's about time that the government stepped up and recognised that, you know, education doesn't just start at the school gates. And if we're going to stay open, they need to fund us to be able to do so safely and sustainably.
Thanks, Sally. Pete, anything to add on that, and any sort of final last remarks from yourself?
Yes, so two things. Valerie, you made a massively important point. I'm in awe of Sally for many reasons, running our childcare group of 45 nurseries. One of the reasons I'm in awe is the work she's done about men in childcare and trying to address some of this gender bit. Last time I looked in Co-op principles, we talk about equality and we talk about equity, and there is an element of saying we should be representative of the communities in which we have got nurseries, and the work Sally and team are doing on that is great, but there's always more we can do, and that always needs to be forefront of mind, I think, as simple and straightforward as that. Fleur, your point about Brexit was well made. Rob and the Co-op Party have helped us earlier this year about trying to get, again, recognition for the early years sector on the migration advisory scores, etc. It seems appalling that some of our EU nationals who are working for us no longer make the list of people who can come into the UK to work. That's an ongoing campaign, and any support you can give us on behalf of the sector for that would be tremendously welcome. So, and Rob, finally to you again, and just a thank you to everybody in the Co-op Party for the support you've given us as a consumer co-op and continue to give us over the last 12 months or so. It's been fantastic and it's well received.
Great to hear, Pete. And I guess, Fleur, we'll just pop back to you on a final word, but I think perhaps on that note, what more can we do? What can we do to help out on this? What can we as a party, we as a membership, what can we do to help you as parliamentarians to sort of represent these issues and get in touch with MPs, is it? Or what else can we be doing to help out?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rob, and thanks, Sally, and thanks, Pete, and for all those who've asked questions. I'll be taking everything I've heard back into Parliament. It's so important. And on that note, yes, write to your MP. Things are fast moving at the moment. To hear from you on the front line is really, really important. To hear there are different voices. You know, should we be open? Should we not be open? Hearing from Pete about the amount that would be lost if nurseries would have to close, and therefore immediately of what the government would need to make up in terms of that £850,000 shortfall. And that's the massive strength of the cooperative movement, is that joining up of voices and speaking together. So do contact your MP, do write to your MP about your experience, what you need, what nurseries near you need, what your own nursery needs, what the early years sector needs, because they will be hearing from others. I have a lot of emails at the moment. I can't tell you how many, obviously and understandably, because MPs have got a different position to normal. It's not the normal legislative timetable. These guidance and rules changes and things that are happening quite fast and in response to hearing from you. So I really would encourage you to speak up, to join together, and to make sure that the early years sector is well represented in any conversation about education, which is what I am always trying to do. And also to be joining the campaign about the shop workers and respect to shop workers. And Pete, brilliant that you're doing that campaign, and I'm really supportive. And the other campaign about Brexit that you mentioned, really, really happy to support as well. So let's all be supporting each other and each other's campaigns at this time, because we're only going to get through this together. I was just watching Biden's speech earlier. Well, really recommend it. So very, very inspired by that. But unity can't be more strong than unity. We really need it now, but especially in the early years sector. So thank you very much.
Thanks, and what a perfect place to end. I think that's the perfect spot. So thanks to yourself, Fleur, Pete, Sally, for joining us. It's been a fantastic discussion, and to everyone else for joining and listening in and contributing. I think it's an incredibly important issue which we know has been overlooked. And Fleur's given us our marching orders. We know what we've got to do to address it now. So let's all get on with that. And thanks again to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you.